Hi, my name is Reese, and today I have a public service announcement for the people of Tanzania. So, in Tanzania, albinism affects a lot of people there, and some people in Tanzania think that albino people are magical and special, and so they try to go after them and get their limbs and like cut them up and do all sorts of crazy things to them for as sacrifices and as things to make like potions and stuff and witch doctors. But I'm here to tell you that albino people actually aren't magical. Sadly, they actually just have a genetic condition and it causes their skin to not have pigmentation. So you might be wondering what albinism actually is. It's a mutation in your genes that causes there to be little to no pigmentation in your skin, eyes, or hair. So often people with albinism, their skin is very, very pale and their hair is usually blonde or even white, and their eyes are usually a blue or a gray because there's no pigmentation in their skin that gives them their color or their hair or their eyes. So this is caused by a mutation in the genes and their DNA. So what is DNA? DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it contains proteins and genes that make you you. So it contains genes that make proteins that make what you look like. So in your genes you have these things called base pairs, and the base pairs are made of bases. You have adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And when these are put together, they form base pairs, which then go to make proteins, which make genes. So the base pairs that match together are guanine and cytosine, and then adenine and thymine. So those two match together to make a base pair. And then once we have our base pairs, well, actually, this is just the process of how DNA is made and like what DNA does. So first things first, we have DNA replication. Before DNA replication, a bond forms between the base pairs, making a strand of DNA. So you have I'll put a picture right here. So you have the double helix look, and that is when the bond forms between them. So then when you have DNA replication, and a thing called an enzyme comes and destroys those bonds, making two separate strands of base pairs. And so then other bases come along and match up with each of the bases on those strands to make two new strands of DNA that are the exact same. They are identical. And then after that, you have DNA transcription, which is when a thing called mRNA, which stands for messenger ribonucleic acid. And when this little thing comes along and it copies parts of a nucleotide sequence, and the nucleotide sequence is the sequence of DNA where you have all the base pairs that aren't connected to anything yet. You have all the base pairs like A, C, G, T, whatever the sequence is, and then you have all those, and then it comes along and copies one little part of that, and then it brings it to come together with other RNA base pairs that are already there, and then they form a thing called an amino acid. And an amino acid will eventually code for something called a protein that will make up your different genes. And when it comes to DNA transcription, instead of adenine matching up with thymine, in this case uracil will actually match up with adenine, so it's a little bit different there. And then, last but not least, we have DNA translation. So in this, a thing called tRNA, which stands for transfer ribonucleic acid, tRNA, delivers the amino acids like we talked about in the last step. It delivers the amino acids to the ribosome where they match up with their complementary base pair codons. And codons are sets of three bases. So a codon could be CGT. That's a codon right there. And then these codons match up with their complementary codons like this. And so they go together, and then these form a chain of different codons, which is called a peptide chain, which will grow and grow and grow until a different codon tells it to stop, and then you have a complete protein. So that's it for DNA. And then moving on, we have mitosis. So Mitosis is the process in which a cell divides into two new cells called daughter cells. And they're called daughter cells because they are exactly identical. So one cell turns into two cells, but they are the exact same. So this process has two parts, and the first part has 4 stages: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. You can remember this with the initials PMAT to help you remember. And then after that, there's this thing called cytokinesis, and cytokinesis is the part, so prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase is the part where the cell is actually starting to divide, but then cytokinesis is when the cell fully divides and ends up being 2 cells. Next, we have this thing called meiosis. This one is a little confusing because it's easy to get it confused with mitosis because they are actually very similar. So mitosis creates normal cells. So if you have blood cells, they will do mitosis to like divide to make more blood cells. But meiosis makes sex cells like the sperm and the egg, also known as gametes. Meiosis is very similar to mitosis because it actually has all the same stages, it just does it twice. So it'll go through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and then when it's done with all those, it'll do it again to make sure so that at the end, instead of having 2 new cells, you have 4 new cells. But also, these cells are special because at the end, these cells are not all similar, they're actually all different cells. So they each have different genes and different DNA in them, which makes them special. And so at the end, each of these cells will have half the number of chromosomes than a normal cell. So when a normal cell splits, it'll split into 2, and then each one has 46 chromosomes. But when meiosis happens, one cell splits into 2 cells, which then splits into 4 cells. And these 4 cells will all have 23 chromosomes instead of having the normal 46. So next up, we have genetic recombination. Genetic recombination pretty much means just that there's genetic variation. And what this means is that when 2 parents come together to make offspring, instead of their child being the exact same as one of their parents, the child actually gets genes from both of their parents to make themselves. So their child will not be exactly identical to either one of them, but will be a combination of their traits. And because of this, it allows people, that's why all of us look different. It allows people to look different. So if you have a sibling, I have a sibling. So I have a brother, and we look different because we didn't get the exact same traits from each of our parents, and so that's why we look different, and that's why it's good to have genetic variation so we don't all just look exactly the same as everyone else. Okay, now we're up to sexual reproduction. So in sexual reproduction, you need 2 parents to make an offspring. So you need an egg cell and a sperm cell, and like I said earlier, those are referred to as gametes. So you need an egg cell and a sperm cell to come together, and then they must meet and join together, and then this little thing forms a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, and then the egg will eventually grow into a fetus, and a fetus is just it's a baby, but it's in the early stages of the baby, and so that's what happens. And like I was talking about earlier, how each sex cell only has 23 chromosomes, and this is because whenever like the 2 sex cells come together, they make they'll join and they'll make 46 chromosomes. And so if each of them had 46 chromosomes at the start, a person would have way too many chromosomes. But this way, they come together and they add all the chromosomes together, and a person has the right amount of chromosomes. So now we're on to mutations and the effects of mutations. So genetic mutations can have many different effects on cells depending on what type of mutation it is. So the type of mutations we have in this are known as point mutations, and a point mutation can be deletion, insertion, or substitution. And then we also have frame shift mutations. So I'll talk about each of those. So a point mutation only affects one codon, and it can either delete one letter of the codon, it can insert another letter of the codon, or it can substitute one letter of the codon. And the reason why this is bad is because, especially with substitution, if you substitute a T when there is actually an A, this can cause for the codon to code for a completely different protein than it was supposed to. So if it codes for a complete different protein, then your genes could be totally different. And then a frame shift mutation is different from a point mutation because a frame shift mutation actually affects the whole peptide chain. So it's when a nucleotide is added or deleted in the chain and it causes the whole chain to shift over. So if we had one whole chain, but then we deleted an A, everything else after the A would shift over one, and it can result in an unequal amount of nucleotides, and then also it will code every protein after that shift will code for a different protein than it was supposed to. So that can mess up your DNA too. So you might be wondering, what's the difference between genetic and chromosomal mutations? Well, first off, chromosomal mutations affect the chromosomes in your cells, which affect the DNA. So they include deletion, inversion, translocation, duplication, and non-disjunction. So deletion is when a part of the chromosome is lost. So a part of the chromosome will just separate from itself and then just not come back. And then inversion is when a part of a chromosome actually splits off from the chromosome, flips itself upside down, and then puts itself back in the chromosome. And this causes the genes because in chromosomes, each gene has its own place in the chromosome. So I'll put a picture right here. But if you have a gene that's in the bottom left corner of the chromosome and then it flips and then it gets lost in the middle, it will not line up with the other chromosome of that gene, and so the proteins will have a hard time coding. Translocation is when two non-homologous chromosomes, and homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that are the same size and weight and shape, and so non-homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that are not meant to be together. So translocation is when two chromosomes that are not the same do the process of crossing over, which makes one chromosome have too much genetic material and the other chromosome not have enough, and then they're the wrong shape and size for their other chromosomes to match up, and so that can cause some issues. Then we have duplication, which is when one segment of the chromosome is repeated so that instead of having just one normal segment of the chromosome, there's actually two identical parts of the gene in there when there's only supposed to be one. So it makes there's too much genetic material in your chromosome. And finally, we have non-disjunction. This is when the chromosomes don't separate like they're supposed to when meiosis is happening. So instead of having the normal 23 chromosomes in each of your 4 ending cells, you're going to have an uneven number. So one will have too much and then the other one won't have enough. And this can affect several things as your cells continue to multiply, because some of your cells won't have enough genetic material and then other cells will have too much. And chromosomal mutations are different from genetic mutations because genetic mutations affect the genes and the proteins that your codons will code for. So those are a complete different thing than your chromosomes. So how could mutations lead to albinism? Mutations could lead to albinism because if you have a chromosomal mutation, for example, like non-disjunction, where your cells don't have enough genetic material and some have too much, the cells that don't have enough genetic material to code for your genes, if these genes were supposed to code for your pigmentation and your skin, eyes, and hair, and you don't have enough of that gene, or if you don't even have that gene at all, this is a mutation that could possibly cause albinism. The causes of mutations can be anywhere from just a mistake that was made by your body when copying the DNA, or it can be outside environmental factors like UV rays from the sun, or if you inhale cigarette smoke, or if you smoke a lot, that could even cause genetic mutations. Okay, now on to cancer. So, cancer happens when your cells start dividing too rapidly, and then these cells keep dividing and dividing and dividing, and these cells are bad actually. They're harmful cells for your body. And so when these harmful cells keep growing and growing instead of dying like broken cells do, they keep growing and growing and growing, and it forms a mass called a tumor. And if this tumor is malignant, which means it's bad for you, this could be very, very bad for your body, and it can be dangerous and life-threatening if your tumor keeps growing or your cancer spreads in your body. However, if this tumor is benign, which means it's not harmful, unless the tumor is blocking something, unless the tumor is blocking like your airway or something, it should be fine. And those tumors don't normally grow if they're benign. Now we're moving on to a thing called alleles. So alleles are someone's combination of genes in their chromosomes. So in the chromosomes, like I said before, each gene has its place. So the place where the genes is, like whatever the gene is, that is an allele. That's one of your alleles. So alleles are represented in Punnett squares usually, which I will talk about a little bit later. And these alleles are presented by 2 letters, and a dominant trait is represented by a capital letter, whereas a recessive trait is presented as a lowercase letter. So you know the difference between those. So there's 2 types of traits, dominant traits and recessive traits. And dominant traits are usually the ones that come out more and the ones that we see more because, like their name, they are dominant and they usually take over the recessive traits. So recessive traits tend to fall back a little bit and come out later. So for example, eye color. So let's say that the eye color brown is dominant and the eye color blue is recessive. So normally, since brown is dominant, people who have genes for both blue and brown eyes will most likely have brown eyes. But that doesn't mean that they can't have blue eyes, because there is a possibility that they will have blue eyes. It's just less of a possibility because the gene for brown eyes is dominant. And it also depends on the alleles of your parents. So I will talk about that just in a moment when I talk about Punnett squares. So Punnett squares are kind of like a thing that you can do to see the possibilities of someone's offspring of having alleles as their parents. So I'll show you an example. So in this example that I'll put on the screen right now, this is a Punnett square that I just did, and it's about eye color, as you can see. So on top we have the male's genes, and on the side we have the female's genes. So these kids, their offspring of these random 2 people, the likeliness of these kids having brown eyes is 75% or 3/4, and then the likeliness of them having blue eyes is 25% or 1/4. So if they had 4 kids, 3 of their kids would have brown eyes, but 1 of their kid would have blue eyes. And I also have a different example, I'll put it right now. And in this one, it's about dimples. And so dimples are a dominant trait. But as you can see, the male's traits are 2 lowercase letters, which means that his genes for dimples are all recessive. And then the female's traits, there is an uppercase letter and a lowercase letter. So when these come together, the likeliness of their kids having dimples is 50-50. So if they had 4 kids, 2 of them would have dimples, but 2 of them would not. So in that case, the likeliness of them having dimples or not is even. And I know earlier I said that recessive genes are less likely to happen, but in cases like this, as you can see, they're even. And sometimes kids probably don't look like their parents to you because of recessive genes, and they might have a recessive trait that their parents did not show. So their parents might have showed, I'll go back to dimples again. Their parents might have dimples, and their parents, or like one of their parents might have dimples and they might show their dimples, but their kid might not have dimples because of recessive traits. And the kid could even look more like their cousin or their uncle or their grandparents, depending on who has what genes. So this was a public service announcement to show the reason why people with albinism actually aren't magical. They just have a genetic mutation which makes their skin less pigmented than other people's skin. So everybody should stop picking on them, and they should stop and they should stop being hunted for their limbs because they are actually not special. They just have different genes than the rest of us.